Good afternoon. So this is about adaptation strategies to reduce the impact of climate change on crop yield. This is a joint work between several people. So we have several people from Ceylon. So Rose, who was a postdoc with us last year in the United States. Peng Zhu, who was a postdoc as well last year, who is now in Hong Kong University. Philippe, you know Philippe, myself, and two people from Naro in Japan. So we have a joint project with them. And the objective was first to retrieve all existing data assessing the impact of climate change on crop yields, and then to evaluate the factors, the main factors explaining the impact of climate change on crop yields. So this is the context. In practice, the impact of climate change on crop yield is evaluated using different approaches. So limited number of studies use experiments to evaluate the impact of climate change on crop yields, changing the temperature using infrared lamps or changing CO2 concentration. But most of the published studies, they use models, so either mechanistic crop models or statistical models. So there are plenty of data based on this, and they are published in different journals. They consider different climate change strategies. The problem is that the information is spread in many different papers, and it's different just by looking at the papers to know what are the main factors explaining the positive or negative impact of climate change on crops. So for those who don't know exactly what is a crop model, this is just a simple diagram explaining the structure of one crop model named Bofrost. Currently used to predict crop yield in Europe. So you have the radiation here, then the light interception. The light interception is used by photosynthesis to produce crop growth. The dry matter is allocated to different organs, and then the storage organs are used to calculate the crop yield. So you have different equations describing all these processes. Usually most of the crop models, not all, but most of them run at a daily time step. Based on this, you can simulate the development. So here it's dry biomass in ton per hectare as a function of the time. You can simulate the accumulation of biomass in different organs. And of course, what is most interesting for humans are the storage organs, because this is what we eat. So basically, to use these models to evaluate the impact of climate change on crop yield, we proceed as follows. So people consider different shared socioeconomic pathways, more or less pessimistic in terms of CO2 emission. And based on this pathway, they simulate climate conditions at specific locations using some bin scaling methods. And then they obtain weather inputs, usually daily weather inputs, like temperature, radiation, rainfall, and so on. These daily inputs are used as input of the crop model, together with other inputs related to soil characteristics, farm practices, and cultivars, and so on. And using all these inputs, the crop model calculates different outputs, like nitrogen content, leaf area, biomass, and crop yield. And here I focus on crop yield. So by changing, in fact, the weather inputs, you obtain different crop yields, but you can also change the crop yield by modifying the farm practices. For example, by modifying the sowing dates, by modifying the harvest dates, by modifying the cultivar characteristics, and so on. So you can try to compensate the effect of the change in the weather inputs by modifications of the farm practices. So a lot of So the objective of this work was to use so many studies like the one I just presented were produced during the last 20 years, and the results were published, and they were based on different types of crop models, different types of climate scenarios, different locations of the world, different crop species, and here the objective is to collect all this information, to put all this information, all this data in one database, and to try to fit a meta model to this global database to map the effect of climate change on crop yields at the global scale. So the idea is to fit a relatively simple statistical model to the database, including crop model simulations, in order to run this meta model at the global scale and study various climate change scenarios, various adaptation strategies, and so on. So the research questions here were, so what are the distributions of yield losses and yield gains at the global scales based on the available agricultural model simulation? This is the first question. So, for example, we want to know whether most of the simulations report yield gains or yield loss for some crops like maize, wheat, and so on. Second question, what are the most important factors explaining variability in yield change projections? So, for example, is it the temperature change, which is the most important factor? Is it the rainfall change, the CO2 change, the change in adaptation strategies? And the last question is more focused on adaptation strategies. The last question was to check whether the considered adaptation strategy were able to mitigate yield losses in locations where yield losses were accumulated.
David?
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Could you come back, please, to the if I understand well, you are doing statistical model based on crop model output. Okay. I have just one question. Why you are talking about global scale? For me, the crop models are it's a model. How it is specific to an area and how you could make it global. Generalize. Okay. Thank you.
So to summarize. Another question.
Are you using EasyMeet data or not at all?
Yes.
Okay, this is EasyMeet.
Gotcha. No. So to summarize, we have crop model simulations that were published or reported in some databases. So we collect all that. So we get yield changes value due to climate change at different locations in different scenarios. Then we use all this data to fit meta models, and we use the meta models to estimate yield change at the global scales without adaptation, and then we do the same at the same locations with adaptation. And by comparing the two series of yield, we are able to evaluate the effect of adaptation at the global scale. And we do that for 4 crops: maize, wheat, soybean, and rice. Yes, so the data. So in order to obtain the data, we went through a systematic review of the literature, and we were also able to retrieve some data sets that were already published. So here you can see where we found almost 5,000 individual studies, and here 178 studies from which we were able to extract some data sets. And after we had to remove duplicates, we screen the characteristic of the paper. So we excluded some studies, for example, some that were not specifying the climate change scenarios, some studies that were too old, some studies without yield change data. So of course, at the end, we end with much less data than at the top. We end with 202 studies. So based on these 202 studies, we extracted the data and put them in a database. Yes. So this is the distribution of the extracted data. So here you have yield changes in percentage. So percentage compared to the current climate condition. So here you have the yield change distribution for maize, for rice, for soybean, for wheat. So here you have the 0. So when the yield change is positive, it means a yield gain due to climate change. When it's negative, it's a yield loss. So here you have the number of yield simulations for each crop. So you see that we have big differences between crops. For maize, we had more than 4,500 data, yield change data, covering 194 locations across the world. For rice, we have 1,519 data. For wheat, a bit more than 2,000. And for soybean, actually, we only have 297 data, so less than 300 data for soybean. So big difference compared to other crops. Here, I don't know if you can see because it's a bit small, but you have the distribution of the data in percentage for different temperature change, so +1 degrees, +2 degrees, +3 degrees, up to +5 degrees. The different colors correspond to different climate change scenarios. So here you have the projection periods, so 2020, 2040, 2060, etc., up to 2100. Here you have the distribution of the simulations across regions. So you have a peak here corresponding to Asia, a second peak here corresponding to Europe. North America is here, Africa is here, because you can see that in fact we have more simulation for Africa than for North America. And here you have different adaptation strategies that were considered in the crop simulations, like cultivar change, fertilizer change, planting date change, tillage, irrigation, soil organic matter management, and others. And here the colors here correspond to different crops. So for example, for irrigation, you see that most of the data were obtained for maize. Maize correspond to light blue. This is a spatial distribution of the simulated data for one climate change scenario, RCP 8.5, mid-century, so 2050. So each point corresponds to one location where at least one simulation was done. So when the blue points indicate the locations with the yield gain, and the yellow to red points correspond to locations with yield loss. So the yield gain range from 10% to 60%. So here 60% of yield gain is simulated. And the yield loss range from 0 or -10%, let's say -100%. So when it's a dark red, it means total yield loss. You lose everything. So it's of course difficult to see whether most of the points correspond to yield gain or most of the points correspond to yield loss, just to show a bit the spread of the locations. So each column here corresponds to one crop. Okay? So clearly you can see that the number of points is smaller for soybean. So again, the descriptive analysis of the data. So here you have the yield change on the y-axis in percentage. Here as a function of current average temperature, mid-century here, end of century there. The color corresponds to 3 RCPs, 3 climate change scenarios. So what is interesting is to see the general negative trend. So it means that so here is the current average temperature. So it's described, in fact, the current climate conditions and the location where the simulation was performed. So it shows that the higher the current average temperature, the stronger is the risk of yield loss. So you have more negative data here and here than on the left part of the graphic. So in fact, here on the left, you have relatively cold areas. On the right, you have relatively warm areas. And when you look at the pattern of the data, you see that there is a negative trend indicating a higher risk of yield loss due to climate change in locations characterized by a warm climate. But so far, it's still descriptive. Huh? There is no analysis so far. Yes, this one I can skip. So now I will explain the second step of the work. So here we collected data, we put the data in the data set. We describe the data set, but now we will adjust a statistical model to this data set. Yes. So we compared 10 models to relate yield change to several factors. So the first model is very simple. It relates yield loss to latitude and longitude. So we try to explain the yield change only using the locations. To relate yield change to latitude and longitude, we used here a random forest model. So it's a standard non-parametric machine learning without strong assumptions between the relationship of between the yield change and the coordinates. We did the same with the second algorithm, gradient boosting, which is another standard type of machine learning tool. And the third model is a bit more exciting because it relates, so the first two are kind of benchmarks. The first two models were used to see if we were able to explain a big part of the yield change variability using only the location. The third model takes into account more factors. It takes into account the average temperature under current situation at the location where the simulation was done, the average precipitation, the temperature change, so the temperature change between the considered climate change scenarios and the baseline, the precipitation change, the CO2, and adaptation strategy, if adaptation strategy were implemented or not. The model number 4 is the same as model number 3, but in model number 3 we use random forest. In model number 4 we use gradient boosting. The model number 5 is the same as the model 3 plus latitude and longitude. So it's a mixture of 3 and 1. 6 is a combination of 4 and 2. 7 is like model 3 and 4, but instead of using gradient boosting or random forest, we simply use a linear model regression. So this one will work well if the relationship between yield change, temperature, and the other factors is linear. And the 8 is like the same idea of the 7, but with interactions between factors. The model number 9 is a model without any factors, but only longitude and latitude using a spatial correlation matrix. So it's a spatial model, a standard spatial model. And the number 10 is a linear model using the correlation matrix handling the correlation between the locations, plus all the explanatory variables. So the idea was to use a set of contrasted models, more or less complex, making some weak or for some of the model weak assumptions, for other model stronger assumptions, and see which one was the best. So to determine which model was the best, we use the following model testing procedure. So for all models, we split the data set by locations into a trained data set and a testing data set. So the training includes 75% of the data, the testing 25%. And we consider successively 2 splitting procedures. The first one, the data split was done such that the test locations were the same as those of the trained data set. It means that at each location, we put some data in the training and some data in the testing data set. The second type of data splitting is different. Here, the data split was done so that all the data, all the yield prediction in the testing data set were from different locations than those of the trained dataset. So it means here that we train the model at some locations and we try to predict other locations. The two are interesting. The first one is interesting to evaluate the capacity of the model to predict heat change for new climate change scenarios using data that were obtained at the same locations. So it's like extrapolating at the same location, but for new scenarios. The second data split procedure is interesting because it is used to evaluate the capacity of the model to extrapolate in space, to check whether the model is able to predict locations that are not included in the training dataset. We did that 10 times. Each time we calculated the root mean square error and R square from the data set each time. So we obtain 10 root mean square error and 10 R square for each model and each type of data split. Yes.
I have just one question on the spatial. You talk about spatial models. What kind of spatial models you have estimated, and how you deal with the prediction of spatial models? Because out of sample, you need the structure of the spatial locations.
So here the spatial model. So you have two types of model taking. Well, all models take into account actually some spatial information, either through temperature, precipitation, or through the location. But the linear models, they take longitude latitude using Matern correlation matrix, which is a correlation matrix, assuming that the correlation between two values decrease with the distance. So those are some results of the model testing. So I show you the best model for each crop. So for maize it was 4, for rice 5, for soybean 5, and for wheat 6. So it's between 4 and 6. So if I go back to the model description, yes. So it's this one, and this one. So it's either random forest or gradient boosting. 4 is without the coordinates. 5 and 6 use the coordinates plus all the variables related to climates and adaptation strategies. Yes.
Did you look only at RMSE and R square? Because I guess that since the model you have more than what the training variables are different between each models, you may better explore those places with more variables at the end of the day. Or did you look also at AIC or other?
No, because the RMSE and R square are calculated on data that are not used for the training.
Okay.
So in fact, they are unbiased in principle. It's independent evaluation using independent data. So this is RMSE. I don't remember for which type of data splitting, but what you can see that the RMSE, so it's percentage, so yield change percentage. So you see it's relatively big, especially for soybean. So the standard error corresponds to the variability between the 10 repetitions, because we replicated the sampling for training and testing 10 times. But we see that for soybean, it's 28%, so it's very large. And it can be explained by the fact that for this crop, we had much less data, something like 10 times less data. For the other crop, it's a bit better, but still it's not negligible. Anyway, we use these models to make some projections, in particular to evaluate the effect of adaptation. So here, this is the application of the best model for each crop at the global scale using a crop mask. So when you are in this purple color, it's a yield loss of minus 60%. When you are in this yellow color, it's a yield gain of something like plus 30%. And when it's a light blue, it's 0. So here you have maize, rice, soybean, and you have 3 maps, because the first map is without adaptation, the second map is with adaptation, and the third map is third series of maps, sorry, is a difference between the first 2 series of maps. So in fact, the last one allows us the last series allows us to evaluate the impact of adaptation. What we see is that first we have a big gradient of yield loss and yield gain depending on the region. If I look at the results obtained without adaptation,